Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation. My name is Minzhou Sang. I am a psychotherapist and a psychology researcher. It is a great pleasure to give this presentation here, and thank you for being part of it. My colleague Hanqiu Xu, she is a pianist, and I have conducted qualitative research last 2 years. We try to understand the music performance anxiety through the first-hand perspective of musicians. By learning from their insight combining my clinical strategy, we hope to help musicians to understand how musical performance anxiety impact them both positively and negatively. And also, we hope to provide some meaningful suggestions for musicians. This presentation has 4 parts. The first one, I will talk about some key definitions and a very brief review about the current research. Secondly, I will present of my key findings from the interview that are related to music performance anxiety. The third one is I will quickly look at the psychological and the neurology aspect of music performance anxiety. It's going to leading more understanding about the mechanism behind the anxiety and helping musicians to enhance their awareness to cope with it. The last part, I'm going to share some of the insight and practical tips combining my clinical experience to provide strategies to managing the anxiety. Let's take a look at the most basic definition of fear and anxiety. Fear means an emotional response to a real or immediate threat. It's like seeing a snake. The feeling is very sharp and focused. And here I want you to keep in mind and what is considered as a threat. It can be very, very vague and often depends on personal experience. It's not everything that makes you feel scary is actually dangerous. For example, if someone is afraid of a snake, and if the person is seeing a poisoning snake in front of them, it is a real threat and the fear makes sense. But if it is a snake toy and someone still feel very scary, the fear doesn't match the actual situation. Because we often generalize what we perceive as a threat, the fear is meant to alert us to the danger. But when a generalization is formed, people may start to feel fearful or something actually harmful. As a musician, when you feel fearful about performances, to ask a question, do the performances truly pose the threats? I think this is a very difficult question to answer. For example, if an instrument fails during the performances, is this a threat? I'm pretty sure for some musicians it does, but for some musicians, they may solve the problem perfectly on the stage and make the show even better. I believe every musician wants to present a great performances and hope shows going smoothly. However, performances are often filled with uncertainty. When you are standing in front of audience, anything could happen. The nature of performances potentially brings threats. Any possible threat can lead to fear on the stage or even after the performances. When we consider whether performances bring threats or even the worst of fearing, the answer may not clear. Therefore, it is reasonable to acknowledge those potential threats exist. To consider of the future threat is anxiety. So anxiety is more about worry about something in the future. Again, just like a fearful feeling, it's very vague but also persistent. Before we talk about the music performances anxiety, we need to know performances anxiety first. It is considered as a subtype of social anxiety. It affects people in different aspects like taking tests, in the public speakings, sports, performing art, and so on. Music performances anxiety is a subtype of performances anxiety. At this point on, I will refer music performances anxiety as MPA. MPA is also recognized as a form of occupational stress that is commonly experienced by musicians. MPA means intensive worry or impaired performing ability. The level of distress often exceeds what could be expected based on musicians' actual skill and preparation. The next is literature review. Because of the time, I will keep it very short. I provide much more details of literature review in the handout. Among music students, MPA ranges widely from 15% to over 80%, and among professional musicians, MPA impact over 20% of population. The next part, let's go over some basic of this research. We use the qualitative research with the interview method. In our interview, there are 12 musicians. The age range is from 18 to 60-year-old. They come from US, China, and Canada, and those musicians come from a very different musical background. And they are pianists, violinists, Chinese folk musicians, singers, opera singers, guitarists, and a guzheng player, which is a traditional Chinese instrument. And our participations include full-time professions and part-time performers. And the musicians who both teaching and performing, some of them are university professors and some of them teaching in private studios. When I analyze interview data, I always consider the overall impression of interviews as a key piece of information. In this interview, I found MPA is taken seriously, not just by individual musicians, but also by the education system. For example, school offers studio class to help students to get used to performing in front of others. But MPA is still very common. Even though all the participations mentioned MPA is very common, everyone is taking it seriously and they all think MPA is not addressed. They all think MPA is not being addressed enough. Our research points out two reasons why this may happen. First, MPA is too common, and there is no way to avoid it. Rather than spending time not feeling anxious, spending more time to prepare is more realistic. Secondly, in our interviews, most of the musicians may not fully understand how the mind and body respond to stress, especially when it comes to how MPA gradually develops. Please don't feel bad about it. It is very common among the overall population. Even mental health professions have the knowledge, but most of them don't even have enough awareness to notice once it happened to them. Within music field, many current coping strategies focus on maintaining good performances under the pressure and staying in control once anxiety kicks in. And those two reasons are connected. Some musicians, more or less, have to perform by holding the anxiety. Better preparation is going to help at this point. But it's also true, many musicians mention that they first believe good preparation will help to reduce anxiety, but once they are really super prepared, they still feel very anxious. Everyone in the interview agreed that well preparation helps lower anxiety in many cases, but it's not guaranteed. They can be super prepared and extremely anxious at the same time. In our research, we hope to give musicians an extra tool once they come to cope with anxiety. Managing fear and anxiety means learning to regulate our body's automatic response. And this is not just a challenging for musicians. This is challenging for every single person. The difference is that musicians have to step on stage that face situations that normally trigger fear and anxiety, that most people rarely experience those situations or never have faced to them at all. I often think musicians are a lot like boxers. When boxers step into fighting, they know they will be hit, and it's painful, and this is a normal human reaction. The key difference is that boxers train hard and build physical strength and resilience so they can prepare themselves to handle it and keep fighting. Very similar logic in music field. The stage brings fear, pressure, and emotional. This making most people feel anxious and overwhelmed. Just like a boxer, musicians are just committed to taking this incredible demanding profession. You really should be proud of yourself as a musician. Now let's talk about some key consistency that we found across all the interviews. First of all, All participants experience a different level of MPA regardless of their performance experience. A well-prepared performance doesn't mean there's no anxiety. Secondly, successful performance doesn't mean there is no anxiety as well. In fact, anxiety is almost always up to there and just in the different forms. Anxiety doesn't necessarily stand in the way of succeed, it is just a part of the process. Third, we learned that MPA is not purely negative. Yes, it brings challenges, but it also has positive effects. In some cases, anxiety can enhance focus and boost the performance quality. As I mentioned before, musicians usually manage MPA in two ways. Control anxiety once it happens and prepare it as much as possible beforehand. I'd like to address something about the current research on MPA that use a quantitative approach, mainly through questionnaires. That means only people who reach a certain score are considered to have MPA. It is a cut-point strategy where you either have it or not. Unlike qualitative research, this approach gives us more details and help us understand the issue more clearly. As you can see, when we ask open-ended questions in interviews, we get a very different picture. It is not just about who has MPA. In fact, almost all musicians feel it. That matter is when it happens and how strong it is. As a vocal professor told us, he would be surprised if anyone doesn't have it. Now let's look at the level of anxiety can vary depending on the types of performances. Music class itself can be considered as a form of a performance. For example, a well-known Chinese pianist said, anxiety built into the nature of a music journey, and the performance is just the core of this career. He said in the second piano class, students are expected to present the music, and he thinks this is the simplest form of a performance, because he would be judged, and whether the feedback is positive or negative and all trigger anxiety. A violin teacher shared that most of her students feel nervous during the class. In small group class, especially, peer pressure often makes them feel anxious. One piano professor said the form of a performance really matters to her. She isn't afraid of a public performing. The most stressful performances are the ones in front of her colleagues because their opinions really matters to her. The guzheng performer said she gets nervous not only at formal concerts, but also even in front of her family and friends. She knows that her family and friends won't judge her, and she allows herself to make a mistake, but the anxiety is still there. A cello player shared that she usually doesn't feel nervous when she plays with others. Her anxiety increases significantly during solo play. Not the case for everyone. One singer told us she feels more relaxed during solo performance. However, when she performing with others, she doesn't know if someone may make mistake unexpectedly that she has to deal with it. And this is a very stressful situation for her. Most musicians we interviewed agreed that the formal concerts, auditions, and exams were the most anxious situation. One pianist said, the show must go on. Once you set a performance date, you can't change it. No matter what happened, you have to show up, and this alone can create lots of anxiety. To sum up about this part, MPA can show up in almost any music performance. The difference is, in general, it tends to feel more intense in formal settings than private ones. Also, each musician may have a special types of performances that trigger their anxiety more than others. This leads to the next summary of the funding, which is about anxiety and evaluation, judgment, and feedback. I'm sure all you can relate to it. Every participant mentioned that evaluation is a large source of anxiety. One musician said, we are always afraid of being judged. So I have summarized the 6 aspects of this part. As I already mentioned previously, solo performance, exams, and auditions can cause significant anxiety largely because the panel's opinion really matters. The second point is that the feedback from audience during the show is associated with anxiety. I'm sure all of the musicians want to have a great interaction with the audience. If it is difficult to interact with the audience, it can be very stressful. For example, an opera singer shared his story. The stage light sometimes is too bright for him to see the audience. This makes him very anxious until he hears applause and he feels more relaxed. Thirdly, taking judgment personally is closely associated with anxiety, which can have a long-lasting impact. Here's an example from a violinist. He used to take negative feedback very personally. Eventually, he realized that the problem wasn't with his performance, but with the way how audience interprets the music that is differently from him. So he began to feel better emotionally once he learned to separate his self-identity from music. The fourth point that I also mentioned earlier, ongoing feedback and judgment in music. The fourth point that I already mentioned earlier as well, ongoing feedback and judgment in music learning can build a long-term anxiety. As the pianist shared that his anxiety didn't even start on stage, it started right away of his second lesson. The fifth point is about minting honor. For musicians, honor is an important reflection of how their performance is evaluated. It can be a strong motivator, but also a stressor. One vocal professor shared that he felt anxious because he needs to maintain his honor that he earned. Also, he truly cared about his performance as well. He said, if I don't care, I wouldn't feel nervous. A Chinese performer also mentioned that it is easy to just complete a performance, but giving a great show is much harder. And this brings a lot of pressure. He put in so much effort not only because he's cared, but also he wants to honor the support and appreciation from his audience. The last point is about self-evaluation, which can cause a lot of anxiety. There were two musicians who were deeply affected by this. A pianist constantly criticized himself during performance, causing intensive fear. Even though other people thought he played well, just because he couldn't meet his own standards, he was not happy with his play. Another Chinese musician told us that he once performed with a famous artist. He was so anxious and he couldn't stop making mistakes, and he began to doubt about himself and end up he couldn't get on the stage for a whole year. Over the time, he worked on his mindset and eventually he had his confidence back. All of the other musicians had a different level of self-evaluation. All of the musicians said that their negative self-evaluation decreased as they grow in their musical career. Now let's discuss our overall finding from the interview about the positive side and the negative side of MPA. As we know, anxiety helps us notice the danger. It feels uncomfortable, but it carries an important message, in which I'm going to explain in much more detail soon. In terms of enhance our mental strength, our goal is never about denial anxiety, but to understand and use it as a support. All participants in the interview agreed that MPA isn't all negative and also a motivator to help increase overall concentration and performing. Anxiety is not only experienced in everyday professional life. For musicians, anxiety before stepping onto the stage is especially significant. Often, the anxious feeling, tension, or excitement felt by musicians before performance can directly affect their performance stage. All of the musicians are interviewed mentioned that their pre-performance emotions are often mixed with excitement and anxiety. Positive anxiety actually helps them to get into performance mode more easier. And one Chinese folk musician said when he has the right level of nervousness and he performs better, if he feels relaxed and he can perform as well. And all the musicians agreed at this view, and they said they all experienced something similar. Almost everyone mentioned having experienced a shift from a positive anxiety to negative anxiety, but they didn't know why it happened. Some musicians told us with more experience and a better understanding of themselves, they've gradually developed the personalized pre-show routines that help them to manage their emotion more effectively. In discussion about the positive and the negative anxiety needs to more fundamental understanding about how physiology body works. And let's pause here on this point for now. After I explain the physiology process behind anxiety, we will come back to this part and take a closer look, and then it will make much more sense about understanding this positive and negative anxiety. So far, I've summarized the key points we gathered from our interview for today's presentation. Due to the time limits, I can only present the most representative aspect. I choose to focus on those most common patterns as seen in MPA, mainly to reflect the shared experience for many musicians. This will help make common anxiety relief methods are more effective as you gain more comprehensive and deeper understanding of the mechanism behind those emotion experiences. I believe many of you have tried different ways of coping with MPA, like staying positive, understand the gap between reality and imagination, building self-confidence, or doing meditation and breathing techniques. Well, those methods all can help, but you may find that they often don't fully address the deeper impact of anxiety. One key reason is that when you apply those techniques, the techniques are not based on a clear understanding how our body actually works. What I hope to share today is a tool that you can use in your real life situation, and the foundation of this tool is established on understanding how our body and mind work. From my clinical experience, I've found that often the struggles people face with their emotions is not because they are powerless, but from that they don't really understand what they're actually going through internally. For the next session, I will introduce the general neurological and psychological mechanism that relate to MPA. This part I'm going to present is quite informative. Please don't worry if you cannot remember or fully understand. It's everything that I include in my handout. You can read it over and over. So let's start with the first concept. It's called learned behavior. Our brain is made up of billions of neurons, which are neuron cells that communicate through synapses. Those neurons form a vast and complex network that are constantly receiving information from outside of the world through our sense, like sight, sound, touch. When we receive those external stimuli, the brain automatically processes information. Like we hear music, see a picture, or sense someone's expression and tone. The limbic system, also known as emotional brain, is involved in this process, allowing us to experience a range of feelings such as happiness, fear, anger, or excitement. Each time we receive a stimuli, the brain forms a neuron firing pathway. This pathway is created through synaptic connections between neurons. Every time this kind of neural activity involves a moment of learning, the emotional response and the meaning that we attached to the experience are remembered by our brain. For example, suppose a student is required to perform a piece of music in class every week. If their performance doesn't go well and the teacher criticizes the student may feel anxious, afraid, or shamed as a result. If those feelings come from the fact that they truly didn't practice enough, the experience might be easier to adjust to. However, if the teacher's criticism is delivered in a harsh tone with personal emotions, or if the performance was actually decent but still dismissed, the student may begin to associate the fact of performing in front of others with emotions such as my self-worth is being denied, I'm not good. Over time, the brain establishes a pattern where performing doesn't just mean playing, it also brings up automatic feeling of low self-worth and related thoughts like I'm not good, I can't do it well. Those responses become a learned neural habit. Once established, every time this pathway is activated, it gets reinforced again. The brain comes to believe that this is a response pattern that needs to be remembered. Here, it's important to highlight a key point. When brain forms those automatic neuron pathways, it doesn't actually evaluate whether the responses are reasonable or not. The brain doesn't ask, is this feeling necessary? Our brain just simply strengthens the response pattern based on how often it's repeated. The more frequently you experience a certain feeling, the more your brain assumes this neuron pathway is important and you really need it. Over time, this pathway becomes stronger and the emotional response becomes more sensitive. At a certain point, a phenomenon called generalization can occur, meaning that emotional response learned in one specific situation are automatically transferred to other similar situations. For example, a student originally feel anxious only during public performances, but as anxiety is repeatedly experienced, the brain continues to reinforce the anxiety equals performing. Eventually, just during the preparation of performing, the student will begin to feel anxious, and the student may even avoid to practice the music. We need to recognize that those automatic responses formed through neural pathway followed a feeling before thinking. Even when your rational mind tells you, oh, there is no need to be anxious, but the neural pathway keep firing in the same pattern, you just continuing feel the same way. This explains why lots of people know they shouldn't be anxious, but they still struggle. More importantly, when we fight with anxiety, it's actually we try to suppress or push anxiety away, but it doesn't change the existence of the neural pathway itself. As a result, many people fall into a frustration they cannot escape the anxiety, which gradually impact their confidence and can even lead to deeper psychological issues, such as anxiety disorder, depression, and so on. In some cases, musicians are eventually have to leave the stage they once deeply loved. To know why this happens, we must understand the brain's primary job is to keep us alive. And to do that, the priority is avoiding threats. That's why our brain has developed a highly efficient system for detecting danger quickly and automatically. In neural system, signal can travel at a speed up to 120 meters per millisecond. This means that your body reacts before you think. This automatic response is an important part of our survival instinct. For example, when a car is speeding drive to you, would you first analyze whether it will hit you or you immediately jump it away? Well, the answer is very, very obvious. This reaction is controlled by the brain's called limbic system, particularly a key structure called amygdala. The amygdala detects potential threats almost instantly and activates the cardio system, endocrine system, and motor system to trigger a repeat fight or flight response, helping protect us from danger. The main advantage of this system it is super fast. However, the downside is also clear. Its response is based solely on similar pattern of stimuli. As a result, it can overreact to the situation that aren't actually dangerous, or it correctly detects the dangerous situation, but react in a way too aggressive actually causes more trouble. You might see those funny videos online where someone gets scared by a loud noise. The person immediately screams or runs away, unable to think if the threat is real, and sometimes end up hurting themselves. It's funny to watch, but it also shows how the brain can overreact based on superficial level clues without considering the consequence. When we face the situation of performing on stage, the same mechanism is triggered. Many people feel anxious and some even want to escape. This is because the brain interprets the stage as a threat, which activates the flight response. Of course, there are also those who realize escaping is not an option and instead switch to a fight mode, getting the courage to face the stage. Also, if you are very excited and looking forward to performing, you're physically getting ready to go to on the stage is also from a fight or flight response. At this point, you may wonder, are we really unable to tell the difference what is real and what is image threats? And are we really controlled by those automatic response? The answer is of course no. Our brain does have the ability to evaluate whether a threat is real, and this ability comes primarily from prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain responsible for higher level thinking, handle functions such as evaluating consequence, planning, rational thinking, and decision making. However, this part of our brain develops late, while it begins to mature repeatedly in late adolescence. It isn't fully developed until around age 18 or 19, which is also why many countries get this age as a legal age for adulthood. But to use this function with real skill, most people don't reach to full mature until their age 25 to 35, and some people probably never reach their mind mature in their entire life. In other words, from the moment we are born, the amygdala-led limbic system is already actively functioning. It helps us to detect threats and trigger fight or flight response, leading to intensive feeling of fear or anxiety. Although our ability to regulate emotion gradually improves as we grow older, the influence of the limbic system, which already established the emotion response to everything around us, remains profound. This means our ability to engage rational thinking, access the nature of threats, and adjust the emotion response develops much later than the emotional response. By the time we begin to learn how to use our rational mind to manage emotion, our brain have already deeply trained by the limbic system. Therefore, truly regulate emotion with reason is a skill. Therefore, the ability to truly regulate emotions with reason is a skill that we must consciously learn and practice in adulthood. Now, once we know what do we experience and what the mechanism behind it, let's talk about how to deal with it. Before we use any method, ask this question. Do we want to deal with the feelings after they already taken over us? Or do we want to catch them before they start? Most of us would probably choose the second option, because once a feeling kicks in, you are not only feel it as a feeling, but also a chain physical reaction happens. Our heart rate changes, hormone and neurotransmitters are released, and our body is already reacting before we can even make sense of it. We just can't shut it down once it has happened. Remember, the neuron signal travels 120 meters per millisecond in our body. And what makes it worse is this. When we think we cannot, or we should not, or unnecessary to feel something bad, we still do. We often blame ourselves for not able to make those feelings go away. We may even feel angry on top of what we already felt. Now we have two layers of negative emotions. One is the original feeling that made us upset, plus the frustration that we cannot stop feeling that way. Then come with a third layer. Our old painful memories are triggered, and we start to recall the past feelings. Then we are overwhelmed by layer after layer. I'm sure everyone relates this more or less. The hardest part is this complex process just happen in a moment. Once we notice that we are emotional, we're already down the bottom of the layers. So, whether we're talking about to manage MPA or other emotions, the key is never just managing it after it happens. The real work is learn how to stop it before it takes over. This is hard because everything happens extremely fast. But if we can make this happen, this is the most effective way to deal with it. Whenever I introduce this to my clients, they all say at the very beginning, oh, this is too hard. And I'll talk to them back. It is not just too hard. This is extremely hard, but everyone can learn it. Once we start to train our attention to catch the beginning, You will be surprised how fast you will learn this skill. Once we learn it, it becomes a very powerful mental skill which will benefit you for a lifetime. Let's dive into the steps how to do it. First, figure out what is the threat. Is that real? When we perceive something only through our feeling, we often exaggerate. But when we look at the situation objectively, we often realize it's not as bad. Even threats were real, didn't you usually handle them quite well? What often causes the most distress isn't the situation itself, but our internal reaction to it. Second, to understand what your feelings are trying to tell you, don't use your rational mind to argue with your feeling. Unwanted feeling never about if it is necessary or right or wrong. They just exist. They are real internal experience at the moment. We need to know what this feeling is trying to express. Then explore why do you feel in this way. Many of those feelings are learned long ago when you didn't have the ability to think rationally. You need to explore under what kind of experience that you learned to react to threats in this way. Third, challenging the thought and the feeling. What are not we are not changing our mind. We are changing the normal pathway of the feelings. Our feelings come away faster than rational mind, and the feelings create thoughts. If you make yourself think differently from your feeling, soon the twist of the internal inconsistency creates more problems. You may good at oppress the feeling, but we can't not feel the feeling. The reason it is so difficult to deeply and thoroughly resolve a emotional issue is mainly because we almost always try to fight the product of a feeling by using the opposite of what the same product. As a result, it often brings more feelings, layer after layer, which eventually trap us deeper and make us have a hard time to get out. For example, before a performance, someone may experience a strong fear. The fear makes them believe they are not capable, so they try to convince themselves not to think in that way. But this attempt to convince themselves is actually a product of the same feeling, they fear, or a reaction that stands on the opposite of what the feeling has created. As long as the fear exists, the inner conflict between those thoughts are unlikely to bring the improvement that we hope for. In fact, it might make things even worse. This is why to clean out the negative feelings is so difficult. Here we can apply a simple technique. We need to be very clear that our target is the most basic feeling inside. When feelings come up, don't try to push them away, just let it be. Accept as what it is, and keep them as a first layer by not blaming yourself or try to fight with it. At this point, focus on your attention on observing the process of how the feeling rising. Even though it happens extremely fast, you still can catch it if you pay attention. Next, observe the thoughts that are produced by the feelings and gently challenging them by asking questions. No need to answer the question, just challenging. This interrupts the old norm pathway and slow it down. In this moment, your brain actually gets a chance to relearn and rewire. It's a powerful way to create a change because each time the old pathway tries to active, the resistance helps the brain recognize this is the pathway we no longer need it. We learned to manage anxiety in general. Now let's see how to manage anxiety positively before getting on stage. Let's go back to the mechanism of fight or flight a little bit. When we feel anxious or fearful, it's usually the flight mode, where your body tells you the situation is dangerous and flight from it. But when musicians describe feeling excited before going on stage, they are often experiencing fight mode and cooperating with the rewarding system that they are so looking forward to gain something by getting ready to fight, especially when they well prepared and looking forward to performing. Although we may not consciously identify this experience entirely as anxiety, Our subjective experience tells us it is a kind of excitement with an anxious tone. In fact, this feeling is largely generated by the same system that produces anxiety, the so-called fight mode. Think about this. No matter how well we prepared, even if we have rehearsed so many times, once they come to the actual moment on stage, we need more physical energy. The extra strength help us to get through the whole performance. Basically, we just need a higher level of physical capacity to face everything on stage, and this capacity also enhances our psychological strength. That is, our body turns on the fight mode to prepare for us. However, the system our body activates to prepare for the fight is the same system is used to prepare for flight. Whether we are flight or fight, the both require a high level of physical strength to complete the action. Just the hormone or neurotransmitters released in each mode slightly different, but the mechanism is the same. This creates the problem. The brain's primary job is survival, period. Any signal may suggest a potential threat must be ruled out. As long as your brain detects the slightest sign that could indicate the danger, anxiety is triggered. Getting ready to fight, we're gonna have a faster heart beating, faster breathing, and so on. Since those phenomena also associate with anxiety, the anxiety can easily trigger. From this perspective, our brain must first eliminate the potential threats before allowing us to enjoy the stage. Remember, our brain doesn't evaluate the action. Our rational mind does. But our rational mind can't just turn it off by saying no. Therefore, internal conflict happens. As a result, the transaction from excitement to anxiety can occur unexpectedly. In the interview, all musicians shared a similar experience. Even they were well prepared, they could suddenly feel anxious, and sometimes it's too strong that it's unbearable. This is not only make them feel anxious, but also confused. So how can we improve? First, as I mentioned earlier, start by practicing awareness of inner experience in daily life. This will strengthen our ability to handle anxiety that comes before going on stage. Once we understand how body works, it becomes easier. Don't let your feeling lead your explanation of reality. Instead, use your awareness and insight to observe what's happening within your inner experience and stand on the purpose of the feelings. Through the regular practice, we will have a stable inner strength when we are facing the intensive feeling before a performance. By the way, the method I'm sharing here is actually the core of meditation. Meditation is not just about sitting quietly. It's really about being peaceful internally so you can sit down quietly anytime. This is all my presentation. Before this research, I had never realized how seriously MPA impacts musicians. I feel bad that I enjoyed the beauty of music without knowing the silent struggle. I'm deeply grateful to my colleague Han Qiuxu for inviting me to conduct this research. And especially thankful to all musicians who took part in this interview. This study led me to reflect on a question I had never explored so deep before, which is how the physical mechanism of anxiety interact with our inner psychological experience. More than half of the strategies for managing anxiety that we discussed today were inspired by the interviews. After I have developed the strategies, I applied them in both my therapy work and supervision. The outcome has been remarkably effective. All the research I have conducted through self-fund, and I do research by passion. I love to have the conversation with people. Although I'm not a musician myself, I have a deep love for music. I truly hope that my profession skill can offer something for musicians. If you have any question, please ask. My email address is also included in the handout as well. I will soon begin a new round of interviews to explore this topic deeper. If you are interested in joining the next phase, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. Once again, thank you so much for being here.